Mute. You're mute. Unmute. Senator Lamb, you need to unmute.
There we go. Thank you, Eric. So thanks everyone for joining us for this town hall meeting that we're having for District 12 and to kind of recap the legislative session and also to take questions from all of you. Certainly these are very unusual circumstances and appreciate the willingness of all of you to participate in the town hall. You know, traditionally we typically have town halls that occur locally in Baltimore County and in Howard County. Now we're doing this as a combo and also online to be able to account for the fact that none of us can meet together, unfortunately. So, you know, together with me, we have Delegate Ebersol, Delegate Hill, and also Delegate Feldmark. And the format that we'll have for this evening is that we will have an hour and a half to be able to give a little bit of an update as to what we worked on during the legislative session. And then where each of us will have 5 minutes and then open it up for questions. I believe there is a Google form that you can submit any questions that you may have. And we will be able to look at the questions that are submitted and then be able to answer them as well. Any questions that we don't get to during the allotted time that we have tonight, we plan to follow up by email as well. And so that's the general format that we were hoping to use for this session. If there are no other comments from the rest of my colleagues, why don't I go ahead and get started and provide a little bit of an overview. And I think we'll each take about 5 minutes to do that and then pass along to questions. So, you know, it certainly was a very interesting legislative session. It was the first legislative session that, well, there are a few different milestones for this legislative session that make it very unique. So number one, it was potentially one of the only times where we entered a legislative session with brand new presiding officers. So just a remarkable change in leadership with Senate President Bill Ferguson coming in, leading the Senate body, and then a new speaker as well in Delegate Adrian Jones from Baltimore County leading the House. And, you know, I think that set a very different tone for us going into the session, but going through it, we also had a pandemic that, you know, took place towards the last couple of weeks that cut the legislative session short. In fact, the first time that we've had a legislative session cut short since the Civil War. So really remarkable in so many ways. I serve on the Senate Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee. It's a very busy committee with a lot of items of jurisdiction that come forward to us. You know, one of the big items that we've worked on in our committee was relating to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, more commonly known as the Kirwan Bill, and the work that the Kirwan Commission had put in place over the last 3 years. I'll let some of my colleagues speak to some of the more finer details of the Kirwan Bill itself. Obviously, all of us have been very supportive of it and wanted to see it passed because it was a real win for the future generation of Marylanders that are going to be going through our school systems. But there was also a very important piece in another piece of legislation that would have provided funding for brand new school construction and also school renovations known as HB1. My understanding is that that bill, HB1, which would have provided about $2 billion in additional school funding across the state, was very much tied to the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, the Kirwan Bill. And the veto, unfortunately, from my perspective of the Kirwan Bill, very much leaves in limbo the status of HB1 and the potential funding that may be available that is really needed for a lot of our schools in Baltimore and Howard counties, many of whom are older and some of whom are bursting at the seams, that we need to have new schools and new dollars to be able to renovate older schools as well. So there's a lot of question as to whether or not HB1 and the funding that's attached to it will actually come forward or not now that a bill that was very closely tied to it, in fact referenced, I think, in HB1, has now been vetoed. So a lot of question marks there that we're certainly concerned about. A few other bills that I'd worked on, just to highlight some, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. You know, we did work on a bill to address the pending COVID pandemic at the time, which obviously has now come into full force. This was a bill that I worked on with the Senate President and sponsored to help make sure that we could get some special protections in place for Marylanders as we saw the pandemic coming forward. So we passed, I think it was SB 1080 in the companion bill on the House side, which is the COVID-19 Public Health Emergency Protection Act, that put in place certain provisions that would help people respond to the pandemic. Number one, it prohibited cost sharing for tests and vaccines when we, and hopefully we'll get a vaccine, but for any tests, there would be no cost to Marylanders if they wanted to test. We also, as part of that bill, expanded telehealth, which has been really critical as people have not been able to go to their doctor's offices in the traditional fashion. To be able to have access to physicians and nurses through telehealth has been really important. It also expanded unemployment insurance benefits. Obviously, we're aware of some of the challenges that have occurred with the Department of Labor in being able to process those applications, and we're very frustrated by that as well. But the bill did provide for increases in unemployment insurance. It outlawed price gouging. Prior to this, there were no provisions on price gouging. It also protected employees from losing their jobs if they were being quarantined by the government. And so all of those provisions were built into place, and we were able to pass that successfully very quickly at the end of session, knowing the likely pandemic that was coming forward already. Let me close on just touching on two environmental bills. One has to do with chlorpyrifos. This was a chemical that had been looked at by the Obama administration to be banned because it caused neurological deficits, particularly in developing children. And it was a very dangerous pesticide that was being used. I was the Senate sponsor, and we were able to work through a lot of challenges, particularly over the last couple of years, and finally passing a ban on chlorpyrifos in the state. Unfortunately, that was vetoed, and we are looking to be able to override that veto when we go back into session, because there are certainly some concerns from that. And then the last bill I'll touch on has to do with BWI and the airport noise that many folks in Southwest Baltimore County and Catonsville, and also in Howard County and Columbia, have heard because of some of the changes in the traffic patterns that airplanes are taking out of BWI and landing at BWI with, as a result of the next generation air traffic control system that was put into place. And we passed a bill that would have examined the health effects of all of these noise occurrences that were occurring in some of these neighborhoods, and to be able to quantify how it was impacting people's health, so we could go back to the federal government to be able to request that these aircraft patterns be changed. Unfortunately, that bill was also vetoed, and we're hoping to be able to override that veto as well. So with that, let me pause here, and happy to take any questions afterwards that people might submit in the chat box, but let me pass it along to my colleagues, and maybe we can start with Delegate Ebersol.
Thanks, Senator Lamb. You caught me off guard there. I wasn't unmuted. I didn't expect to go second, and I certainly appreciate it. To be sure, one of the most difficult bills we worked on this session was a blueprint for Maryland's future. We spent a great deal of time in advance of this session with what's called the Kirwan Commission, which is what led to the blueprint bill, which laid out a lot of the conditions that we thought were necessary to have a world-class education here in Maryland. This commission took this work seriously. It was not light work. It took over 2 years to complete it. They made a number of recommendations. But what the Kirwan Commission says is not necessarily what we have to do legislatively. And so we crafted some very careful legislation to actually direct funds to important programs in our state that have been shown by research to improve educational outcomes in an equitable manner. Among them, certainly the expansion of pre-K, which is very near and dear to me, that we expand pre-K to 3- and 4-year-olds, especially to those in low-income groups who have difficulty affording it and difficulty accessing it logistically. But also, this would have given attention to career and technology education programs. It would have worked very hard to retain good teachers and attract good ones, not just through salaries, but also by creating a career pathway for teachers that lets them advance without necessarily taking them out of the classroom, AKA going into administration. They could do other work. It was also laden heavy with accountability. There were accountability boards written into it that would have been populated with administrators, teachers, and parents that would have visited schools to see if indeed they were implementing the programs as they were laid out. We spent a lot of time passing this bill. We had it passed, ready to pass nice and early. We fully expected that the governor might veto it. When you end a session early, this causes a problem because if he had to veto it early enough before we left session, we could have overridden that veto. And Senator Lamb is absolutely correct that not only did he veto this bill, but he vetoed a school construction bill called the Built to Learn Act in an ancillary fashion. The very last section of HB1, which is the school construction bill, says that that bill will only become active should the blueprint, which is HB 1300, also become law this year. In fact, I'm working right now to determine if overriding this veto will actually then kick in HB1, the Built to Learn Act, or if it will actually, on the other hand, we'll have to pass it again somehow. I think we can. There's a great deal of support for this. But to me, having these two bills tied makes a lot of sense because to me, there are three important things you need to have a good education. You need to have a great facility. You need to have an outstanding curriculum, which is what I've talked about some. You also have to have very good staff. To build a really nice school, but not necessarily bring a curriculum forth and staff forth that can accomplish that, will not fulfill the entire need that we need for education. We got stalled on something else that we worked on a bit, which was implementing sports wagering in the state. What you will see on the November ballot is you will see a question that will ask you if indeed the legislature will be allowed to pass legislation relative to sports wagering. And the way we wrote the original legislation, if indeed it happened, was to have all of that money go into the Education Trust Fund and toward helping fund the blueprint. In fact, the structure bill did not make it, but the referendum will still be there in as much as if we don't do it this year, we'll have to wait another 2 years. And so we're looking for that source of revenue, which we need so badly. Now that casinos, which are a reasonable source of revenue also for education, are actually not bringing in revenue right now. Personally, I had a couple bills that almost made it. One about creating adult changing tables for adult disabled people. Senator Lamb and I did actually pass a bill that will create truck monitoring in Southwest Baltimore County that will allow so that trucks that are cutting through neighborhoods to get between major routes will be fined or cited for that. We had an issue around the Real ID license, which is almost not noticed right now, but about fixing some of the problems with people having to renew their licenses. For now, the deadline has been extended federally, so it's not much of an issue, but it does quell a problem of people having their licenses taken away. And finally, I had a bill with libraries that would have actually prohibited libraries, and there are only about 6 left in the state, that fine minors for late books, but at the same time would have raised funding for libraries, both their capital budgets and their per capita money that we give them for each student. That bill was passed by the legislature, but unfortunately vetoed in sort of the sweeping veto that Governor Hogan did on anything that seemed to cost more money. And I see a question later on about HBCUs, and that was his justification. I think we'll talk about that, but I'm sure I'm at 5+ here, so I'm going to stop. And let's see, I guess we'll just go alphabetically. Delegate Feldmark, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you. So I think I'm going to try to keep it brief. We'll see how this goes. I know a lot of the key issues my colleagues have already touched on. So I just want to quickly talk about a few bills. So I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, on the Revenue Subcommittee, and on the Election Law Subcommittee. And I know we have some election-related questions, so looking forward to discussing that, and certainly in a different light today, given some of the disconcerting news that we got today about yesterday's election. But before we get to questions, I just want to highlight 2 bills that luckily we're able to get through both houses before we adjourned early. 2 of the bills I sponsored. One was dealing with state employees in our juvenile justice system and providing whistleblower protections for those employees of the Department of Juvenile Services if they have concerns about what they're observing in our youth facilities, so that they can report them to the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit without any fear of retribution or disciplinary action. I think that's something really important. It's an issue that a constituent brought to me, and our juvenile justice system has had some issues, and that's what prompted the establishment of the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit several years ago. So it's really important that our employees who have the frontline view of what's happening in facilities are able to share concerns freely so that things can be addressed if necessary. The other bill is the Apprenticeship Startup Act of 2020. And this was taking an existing tax credit that we have for employers who provide apprenticeship programs and reworking it to help incentivize additional businesses to start apprenticeships. And if you're not familiar with apprenticeships, it's a job, a full-fledged job, not an internship, right? A full-fledged job that is accompanied with not only on-the-job training and mentoring, but also classroom education. And it's a great model for filling skilled positions, areas where we have needs in the labor market. It's been very successful in some fields and really largely unused in others. So we're providing incentives to help businesses look at setting up apprenticeship programs in other areas where they haven't existed before. As my colleagues mentioned, with the abbreviated session, a number of bills fell victim to timing, but we'll try again. We'll try again next year. Before I wrap up, I do just want to take a moment to thank our interpreter, Brenda, who's with us. And hopefully we also have functioning closed captioning. And I also want to thank the constituents who brought this need to our attention. And we seek to be as accessible as possible, and we seek to be as responsive as possible. That's certainly my approach, and it's part of what makes me proud to work with this team. As we look at our legislation, a number of examples are suggestions that came directly from constituents. So please, keep that in mind. If you have ideas, if you have suggestions, we want to hear them. We want to work with you on those. So I'll stop there until we get to questions. And Delegate Hill, I believe you're up.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us. This is such a strange time. Senator Lamb, of course, talked about how unusual the session was. And you all have been reading about it. And in some ways, here we are in June. We ended session on March 18th. And already it feels like that was years and years ago, because things in this country and things in the state have been moving in such rapid fashion. I think most of the people I talk to, and I would say the same thing for myself, I don't even look at days anymore, right? There's no Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's another day, another day. I don't know when the weekends are coming. So everything's just a little confusing and different, and things are changing. And obviously dealing with the pandemic, and now dealing with, the horrendous visuals of George Floyd's death while in custody, and the response to that, and how it is really bringing the conversation that we've been engaged in for quite some time to a whole nother level. Again, just makes on a day-to-day basis it really difficult to stay focused on the legislative session. So I'm going to just hit a couple things. As was already mentioned, because the legislative session shut down early, all of us had some bills that were making it through, had come out of the House or come out of the Senate and had crossed over, that just died. I had two bills that passed, and both of those were vetoed. So my report is very quick. One was the bill that I cross-filed along with Senator Lamb that he's already mentioned, which was the health study for air traffic noise at BWI. And the second was a bill to provide $100,000 of funding for community organizations, not-for-profits, that help senior citizens age in place. This was a follow-up to a bill that I passed the previous year that set up this program. We called it the NANA bill. And the governor, even though we set the program up in the Department of Aging, the governor in this past legislative budget did not choose to put funding in. So we were able to pass legislation to put that $100,000 in. That was vetoed. And like so many things that we're looking at now when we're dealing with the realities of the pandemic and what our new normal may or may not look like, I think that that veto was particularly irksome, because helping our senior citizens at this time stay in places such as their home where they're not at the same kind of risk that we're finding, not surprising, that our seniors who are in more confined and communal places, this would be the time that we want to make sure, particularly since the usual access to resources that seniors have so they can go out and get their own things. We would want to make sure that they have adequate support so that resources can be brought to them and that they can stay home. So that was particularly irksome of the many vetoes. And then I sit on the Health and Government Operations Committee. So we were working on a lot of bills related to, as was mentioned, telehealth, and particularly with respect to behavioral health supports. And so a lot of that got through. And one of the other things that we did on an emergency basis that Senator Lamb didn't mention was we also made sure to extend the open enrollment period for the healthcare exchange, because we recognize that as the pandemic rolled out and people were looking at losing jobs, and of course that's turned out to be in unprecedented levels, that a lot of them were going to lose their healthcare. And we didn't want that to be an issue. So I'm gonna stop there, and we'll, I guess, go to questions. We just switched Brenda's. So Clarence, you want to go?
I think I was on mute while I was talking.
You were muted
on
again.
mute, but so just to remind the audience, I muted myself, but just to remind the audience that there is a Google form for you to submit questions live that we are monitoring. So if there are questions that you would like to submit, you just need to go to the link for the Google form, enter the question in, and we will see those questions and be taking those audience questions as well. So let me start with, there have been a few questions, and I think this was referenced in something that Delegate Ebersol had already mentioned, the HBCU bill, so the Historically Black Colleges and Universities. There was a bill that was very important to a lot of us that we wanted to see passed. There is a legal history behind this bill, which I'll let some of my colleagues answer to as well. But the question was, what was the governor's reason for the veto of the HBCU bill? And are there enough votes to override? And there was another question as well that said, I'm deeply troubled by the governor's veto of the HBCU bill. What will be done to settle this longstanding issue? So that's the question. Let me pass along to some of my colleagues.
I can
Don't all jump in at once.
I can speak to that, at least parts of it. The HBCU bill came out of, as Senator Lamb alluded, a long legal history, and one in which the courts have already found that Maryland is responsible for this compensation. And so it seems really foolish to have vetoed this bill, which would have funded the settlement, because without that, the state is, one, going to keep spending money, fighting, doing the right thing to do anyway, which I personally find very troubling, and will ultimately, probably, assuming the system works, still have to pay the money, right? So we're delaying and spending more money in the process. So even if you don't buy into the sort of moral obligation or legal responsibility, it just doesn't make sense to me fiscally. So I think that's important perspective, and I hope that perspective will, together with the legal responsibility and the moral obligation, be enough to help us override that veto.
Also, I
So-
believe that it is the victim of some exaggeration. Okay, you will see a figure with this bill of $580 million, almost well over $500 million. What you don't see written with that is that's over 10 years. So what we're talking about is a $58 to $60 million amount each year to solve this problem. The other exaggeration that occurred was in the budget shortfall that was originally predicted by the Department of Legislative Services. And if you read the governor's reason for vetoing this, and by the way, a host of other bills, he lumped a bunch together all at once as if they were equal bills. And I think we would argue that the two that I've talked about, the HBCU and the blueprint, are not necessarily equal to the others. To me, they were more significant. I think lumping them together was bad, but I also think his veto was based strictly on the fact that we can't afford to spend more money at this time. I don't think he has a clear picture of that. And in another answer, I'll talk about the funding for the blueprint should we overturn that veto as well. But we're on HBCUs, and I'll stick to it.
Okay, so for those who aren't aware of what this lawsuit was, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to go back to first names. I'm giving, and the reason is, okay, you're good, Jessica, because one of the comments saw someone yesterday, one of our constituents, who just commented that they really enjoy coming to our town halls and they like the collegiality of it. And we are normally, Terry and Jessica and Eric. So I think we've introduced ourselves. So I mean, no disrespect to anyone out there. I'm just going to call everybody by the first names and hope you'll do the same. This is what the history is in brief. There was a lawsuit filed over 10 years ago that alleged that the state of Maryland had deliberately worked to undermine, frankly, the success of the historically Black colleges, of which Coppin State, and Morgan's not part of the lawsuit, but Morgan, Eastern Shore, and Bowie, in some practices. And one of the practices, is, for instance, is that there was an agreement that was made many years ago that all of the state schools would be treated equally in determinations of how funding should be supplied. They would also not compete with each other for certain key educational programs, so that certain schools will be given certain programs to almost like magnet schools. And the idea was to have a diversity of students to be able to go to the various schools. One of the accusations that was found to have merit was that programs were set up on HBCU campuses that when they were found to be successful, they were duplicated on the non-HBCU campuses. And what that ended up doing is pulling students away. And similar lawsuits have been settled. The most often quoted one is a Mississippi case where the findings there, when they settled their lawsuit, or the judicial finding was $700 and some million. So to Eric's point, this settlement of 500 some was considered really small potatoes when you looked at the Mississippi settlement, which was about 500 in 2002. So here we are 20 years later, it would have had about a 700,000. So the concern was that without settling this, the cost to the state would be much, much greater. There was also, since the court had already found that Maryland was at fault and basically guilty, what's been dragging out for the last several years is what Maryland's going to pay. And so the sense of the legislature is that we are guilty. Let's settle this. Let's make sure to put the systems in place to help our HBCUs, which, educate an enormous amount of our population, and particularly when we talk about African Americans and other minorities, and we're talking about the disparities that we see in many areas of our society, but particularly in healthcare, because these are the institutions that educate a significant number, if not the majority of our professionals, to not make sure that they are functioning at optimal capacity and have all the resources that we make sure that University of Maryland itself gets, our flagship university. It doesn't serve us as a state well, and it certainly doesn't serve that population group. So for many reasons, it was just felt this was long overdue. And so the veto, you asked for the reason he gave was that he didn't want to spend money when he didn't know what the pandemic would cost. That was the reason he gave for vetoing everything and for not signing anything else into law. I agree with what's already been said. I think it was an excuse to veto a bill he would have vetoed anyway. His offer a couple of years ago was $100,000 to settle a case. I mean, it was significantly less. And it was not, it was a slap in the face. And his only excuse was saying, well, O'Malley offered even less than that. So this is, you know, take it or leave it. And we've seen that played out in other places as well. Just take it or leave it, be happy with it.
And the only other thing I'll add to that is that, you know, obviously I was very disappointed too, along with all of us, with the outcome of this. There was a lot of support in the legislature for this solution. I think on the Senate side, it passed unanimously, bipartisan unanimous support. I think there was bipartisan support in the House too. And so while there are the votes to be able to override this veto, I think there's some provisions of it that do not allow the override to take place. So within the bill itself, it said that there would have to be a legislative agreement formally accepted by all the parties by December 1st for the funding to be able to move forward as part of this agreement. However, because the bill has now been vetoed, we do not have the ability to override that veto before December 1st. And therefore, this solution is not tenable, even if we were to undertake that effort when we got back into session. We would essentially have to start from scratch, anew again, to be able to pass new legislation cleanly to be able to do this. And so, you know, all this does is delay another inevitable solution that is really needed for our HBCUs and is well deserved. And so we're certainly disappointed by, you know, the outcome of this. So do you want to add something?
Just real quick, parenthetically, we have a question from Sir Timothy Ellis asking us about Lansdowne High School in particular. And it's important to point out that the veto of this bill could endanger the funding that would be in place to replace that school, something that the county has committed to, but will need the money. And so it's not only a large, I'm sorry, we're on the wrong issue. I'm on the wrong one. Sorry.
Actually, that was the so Eric, that was the question I was going to go to next anyway.
But let me just add, because Clarence, as you said, that we would not be, you know, we have no ability to override the veto in time. The caveat is unless leadership decides that we're going to have a special session. And so far, we've had no indication that they feel that they have a need to do a special session. But because this was a priority bill for the speaker, it may well be that a decision will be made later in the year once the COVID situation has settled out and we have a better idea of where we are going forward, that, you know, it's still possible a special session could be called, although I've heard no rumors.
Right. There was an announcement earlier as we were adjourning that there would be a special session in May, certainly with the pandemic going on and still ongoing. That was quickly canceled. We're not certain if there would be the means to be able to have a special session given the current environment and the safety, of everyone involved. I'm not even certain personally that, we would be safe to go back into session in January. So, there are a lot of questions that are unanswered here because of the pandemic. And we're going to have to take a closer look at that as it gets closer. But the next question I was going to touch on out of these questions that were submitted were actually the ones that Eric had kind of cited. There was and I'll tie these two questions together. One of them has to do with the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, the Kerwin bill. The question was, will the House and the Senate override the governor's veto of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future bill? And also, on Lansdowne High School, are we going to be able to build a new Lansdowne High School after 57 years? And how would we address that? Anyone want to take that one up? Eric, I guess you were starting to talk about that one.
And I'm sorry about that. I was thinking ahead. I got ahead of myself a bit there. That never happens any other time. Yes. Well, the answer is that we have sufficient votes to override the blueprint. In the House, the vote went pretty much along party lines. We only need 86 votes to override a veto. We have 96. And there were 99 Democrats, and only the 3 of them that didn't vote for it were not voting that day. They were excused that day. So I feel like we'll come back to it. The question becomes, well, how can we override it if we can't afford it? The answer is we can. We passed a different version of the blueprint in 2019 that is funded and ready to go. Now, there will be probably some adjustments, and the Board of Public Works can do that. But the blueprint bill that we're discussing doesn't actually begin to take funding until 2022, which means there's plenty of time to pass this bill with all of the rich curriculum and changes that are in it, in addition to hoping for being able to fund them and still being able to pass legislation in coming sessions to adjust that, should that be necessary. Again, nobody is sure. As I point out, some of the predictions that were made for the end of this fiscal year, the year ending in June 30th, were badly inflated, or you would say deflated, in terms of the amount of money that actually was going to be realized in the general fund from revenue streams for taxes and other sources. And so we don't know for sure how revenue will bound back or how it won't. But the thing not to do is give up on an entire plan. The bill's 200 pages long. The first 70 or so pages are about funding. And the other 120 or 130 are about programs. And we can't give those up. So the answer is, I do think we'll override it. And I think we'll make adjustments if we need to.
Can I add to that? I think, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that in the legislature and in all public policy work and in all advocacy work, no victory is ever permanent, okay? And so passing the blueprint was a big victory. Happened to be a short-lived one until the governor vetoed it. Overriding the governor's veto will be another victory, and we will have to keep fighting for education funding every year, right? We know that just because there's a law that requires funding for priorities that we've set, that doesn't actually mean the governor is going to give us a budget that funds those priorities the way the law calls for. We see that every year with community colleges, and we have to work to restore funding as much as we can. So we need to override this veto, and it is going to be a huge accomplishment, and it has been a huge effort, and the advocates have been phenomenal, and we won't be done after we override this veto. We're gonna have to keep working on it.
So the only thing I'll add to that to answer the second part of that question is about Lansdowne High School. I think all of us are on the record in being very clear that we think there needs to be a new Lansdowne High School, that it needs to be a top priority for Baltimore County. Certainly we're very disappointed with the fact that the Build to Learn Act funding, which would have provided $2 billion in additional school construction and renovation dollars across the state, is certainly in limbo with the veto of the blueprint bill. And what that means for Baltimore County is, uncertain. The county executive with Johnny Olszewski has made a new Lansdowne High School a priority, and we are committed to that as well, and we hope to be able to see that through. And we're going to do everything that we can to ensure that those additional school construction dollars are there. And it's not only for Baltimore County, but also for Howard County. We have some very crowded schools in Howard County within our district too. When you look at Howard High School at almost 140% capacity, there's certainly needs within Howard County as well as the fastest growing public school system here in the state, for us to be able to ensure that our schools do not remain overcrowded and that there's sufficient resources and support necessary. So, we're hoping to be able to tackle that as we get back into session, when that might be. So let me move on to another question. And this question, there are a few questions that have to do with as many of you know, yesterday was primary election day in Maryland, a very different primary election than we ever have had. We had almost a completely mail-in election with some very limited in-person voting sites. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to the news over the past day or two, there have been a lot of concerns about problems that arose as part of the primary election process yesterday. In fact, the Lieutenant Governor just today suggested that the chairman of the Board of Elections in Maryland should resign because of some of the issues that came forward that were unaddressed as part of yesterday's election. So there have been questions here about how will the legislature address the problems that occurred in the primary election? How will we be able to protect the election that's going to be taking place in November? What will be done to ensure that the problems that were brought up yesterday as part of the election process do not continue moving forward. There are a few of us that serve on election-related committees. I know on the House side, it's Ways and Means, and then on the Senate side, it's the committee that I serve on, Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs. But let me turn it over to my colleagues to address it first, and I'll wrap up at the end.
Sure. So I'm happy to, well, I shouldn't say I'm happy to speak to this because I'm actually really very concerned and disturbed that we're talking about problems that we saw in the primary election, and we absolutely need to make sure we do not have the same issues in the general election. So first off, I know one of the questions was about whether the general election will be conducted primarily as a mail-in election, as the primary was. That has not yet been officially determined, and ultimately that will be at the governor's direction. My hope is that we prepare for mail-in, because I think we will be in a lot of trouble if we don't, and then find ourselves in a second or third wave of the virus spiking. So I think we should be preparing for a mail-in election in November. The most recent problem, there have been a series of problems with the mail-in elections related to list maintenance and the vendor who is doing the printing and mailing of ballots, and then the most recent revelation of a problem was that in the Baltimore City Council race for the first district in the Baltimore City Council, there was actually an error on the ballots that made those votes not properly countable. And so that is a fundamental failing of our system, and really, really disconcerting. There is a hearing that the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, along with the respective committee chairs in each chamber, has scheduled for June 16th for the Board of Elections to come and answer for everything that has been going on, and understanding how these issues are going to be addressed in time for the November election. I think it is really, really fundamental. The integrity of our election system is the core of our democracy. And, the only thing that comes close to being as important as the integrity of our election system is people's confidence in that election system. And I am really concerned that we are going into such an important election with such a confidence jarring experience. So I don't have, we don't have the solutions and the answers right now, but we are definitely going to be working on that over the coming weeks to make sure we are prepared for November.
If I can add just one thing, and I think I serve on Ways and Means along with Jess, although she's on election sub, I follow along with what goes on there. We, as a group, I think many of us felt that mail-in balloting was a really good idea. And had we been able to move toward it a little more slowly, I think perhaps we might have been able to do with a little more integrity than has occurred apparently this time. Nonetheless, I don't want this to put people off. I think the idea of mail-in voting will do something that we try to do with every election bill that we pass, and that is, it's easy, increase voter participation. We want more people to vote. We're not telling them who to vote for. We're not asking what party they're from. We just want more people to vote. And the fact is simple. You can look at the states that have adopted mail-in balloting. Their voting percentages have gone up. And so we, unfortunately, were placed, and the Elections Board was placed in a difficult position of having to organize this rather quickly. And I'm sorry that some mistakes have been made. I do not want this to become a litmus test for the future of mail-in balloting.
And I'm going to add one other thing, because I think that some of the mistakes and the errors that you see reported in the press are taken a little bit out of context. And I think that, Jessica and Eric and Clarence, I think, know this, but I want to make sure you guys do. So for instance, when you see that, ballots were sent to addresses where people hadn't been in years, all right? One of the things that the Board of Election, the decisions that they made, starting with the special primary, was that if we want to ensure that everyone who can vote does vote, that there's going to be some duplication and ballots may go to the wrong place. That doesn't mean that ballots get counted multiple times. So the signature, there's a tracking number, the barcode, those were all ways to track the ballots as they returned so that only a single ballot would be counted. But one of the decisions, so to put it another way, the decision was made to send out a lot of ballots, and we'll purge them when they come back to make sure they are what they are. You also saw, and people were confused about this with the special primary as well, a request that in some cases people put a proof of address. And that was, again, because we don't have the usual process where people come in and they sign and they affirm who they are. Or if you're voting in person, you might show up in your new neighborhood and you say, oh, I moved a long time ago. You do a provisional ballot. So part of it was a mechanism just to be sure that we weren't losing people who had a right to vote by making decisions up front about where things were. And I think there were other things like that. So the issue is, were people voting illegally or voting multiple times? And I think we're going to find that the answer is, at least following from the special election, that because of the barcode tracking, that wasn't an issue. But the lateness in deliveries and all that, and I'm one of the people who I had to request a duplicate ballot because I made a stray mark. And the Board of Election folks, they were working remotely too. So put the request in. A day or so later, maybe 2 days later, someone called me on the phone number I'd given them at whatever time of day or night. And then we went through what I had to go through to get the duplicate thing. So we have to look at it. But the main issues are, was there fraud? Were there people who should have been able to vote who were excluded? And was there interference that would affect the outcome of the election? So those to me are the major issues. We want to get that right. The other things are important, but not as critical.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anything to add to that. So, we'll move on to the next question. Certainly there's been, I think speaking for all of us, we're horrified at the murder of George Floyd that took place last week. And it certainly brought to light a lot of questions regarding law enforcement use of force. So there have been several questions here with regards to that, some more specific, some more general. Let me just touch on a few of them and then just open it up to my colleagues. So one of them comes in saying, Delegate Hill was a co-sponsor of Anton's Law. This bill would establish that the use of force and deadly force by a police officer is justified under certain circumstances, establish that records relating to complaints against law enforcement are not personnel records for certain purposes, and certain provisions regarding the custodian of those records and how complaints can be lodged to law enforcement regarding instances of excessive force. and also require that investigations, interrogations of law enforcement be conducted by neutral parties. There's a question here with whether Delegate Feldmark and Ebersol would commit to co-sponsoring this bill, and whether myself would also commit to co-sponsoring that. At least for speaking for myself, certainly I would be one to co-sponsor that. I see Jessica nodding as well. And I think Eric is nodding as well. So I think to that point, yes. There are other questions, and let me just throw these out there. What is the status of state support for evidence-based anti-bias and de-escalation training for police in Maryland? And what have legislators done to help ensure that that is available statewide? What is the legislature doing to hold police officers accountable for their actions in hopes of avoiding another Freddie Gray or George Floyd from happening here in Maryland? And how are we reimagining police in the wake of continued police violence? And what are our positions on that? Would we support legislation to prohibit police agencies from acquiring or using military type equipment on citizens expressing their First Amendment rights? And whether we support investigation of racial disparity charges made by police departments and prosecutions for alleged crimes with a mandate for legislative actions to alleviate such disparities in uses of force with different populations within our community. So let me turn it over to maybe Eric to start, and then we can go around.
Okay, so at the top of this hour, Senator Lamb mentioned the new leadership that exists in the House and in the Senate, and I'm very proud of Speaker Jones. We can go to demonstrations. Several of us have been to protests and demonstrations this week to voice that. That's a good thing for us to do. That's a very supportive thing for us to do. But she has announced a police accountability work group. Now this is big stuff. It's going to be chaired by Delegate Vanessa Atterbury, who is the Vice Chair of Judiciary. It was thought of by the Chair of Judiciary, Luke Clippinger, along with Speaker Jones. And they are going to be looking at a number of issues. And I have the document in front of me. I'm going to scroll down a little so I can just read a little bit of what it is they plan to look at. They're going to review policies and procedures related to the investigations of police misconduct, including Maryland's Law Enforcement Bill of Rights statute. They're going to determine the viability of uniform statewide use of force policies and arrest procedures, which some of that is in some of the bills that some of you have asked about in other places. They're going to review the use of body cameras and disclosure of body camera footage. They're also going to identify national best practices of independent prosecution of law enforcement related crimes. I don't think that'll be the end of it, but that's a great start. And what that should do is that should actually indicate real legislation that we put forward in the next session when we meet that will identify these things. Now, we work under the restriction that we're not in session right now, so we can't pass this. What we can do is we can think about it. We can have good minds thinking about it. It's a nice committee. I've taken a look at it. We can certainly send you the list of legislators that are on there. Disappointed that I'm not there, but there are only, there's 141 of us, and only so many people can get on board with these things. But I'll be watching carefully, and I'll be hoping that we'll come up with some concrete best practices that we will implement and make law in the state of Maryland.
I just want to add, I think, Eric's absolutely right. The work groups are, our mechanism for coming to action that is going to be effective. And a few years ago, in our first term, and Clarence, Eric, in our first term, the one of the biggest piece of legislation that we put through was the Justice Reinvestment Act, which was a first step in Maryland looking at how we have been doing criminal justice systemically from A to Z, and how we can make adjustments to actually serve the cause of justice, keep people safe, and do what we're supposed to be doing in terms of respecting the laws and making sure that the police are supported, as well as that people who are accused of crimes are given due process. So it looked at criminal. We've also looked at our bail bond system. And so we've, following the court's lead, we passed legislation so that things in the past few years have changed so that bail bond is becoming a thing of the past. There are some problems with the system because the exchange for that is that we're putting people on monitors that they have to pay for. But the idea was that if you had money, you weren't kept on pretrial release because you could pay for bail. But if you didn't have money, whether eventually you were proven guilty or not, whether eventually the charges were even dropped, you could spend months in jail just waiting to go to court. So we're reforming that part of the system. The Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, which is going to be part of the work group, we've been looking at that and picking at that for many, many years. And there is certainly a renewed commitment to go after it. And judging from some of the behavior that we've seen at many of these protests here in Maryland, where law enforcement at times has been obviously supportive of the issues, we may have turned the corner where instead of talking about reform being, sort of other folks talking to the police union and the state prosecutors saying no, these most recent incidents may have finally turned the tide so that the police union and even the state prosecutors will be saying, we agree with you, the system is broken. How can we work to make it better? Because the best solutions are going to come when we're not working with attention across the way, but when we all acknowledge that this can't stand. So I'm hoping that that's where we are now.
Well, and I'd just like to add briefly, I think we're very much in agreement on most of these issues. And so I want to just point out for just education of the process, not being signed on as a co-sponsor should not be taken as a sign of lack of support. There are all kinds of reasons why bills we may have intended to co-sponsor or said, that sounds like a great idea, but by the time we caught that delegate on the floor, they said, oh, I just dropped it, and so I think that is important to recognize, having your name on a bill is a nice thing to be able to talk about. It's not the indication of support or non-support. The other point I want to raise that is not specifically called out for this work group, but I do plan to have a conversation with Delegate Atterbury about it, and because I think it's closely related and it just has to be part of the conversation, is the school to prison pipeline and the criminalization of our students and what role law enforcement should be playing in relation with our school system. And so, I think that is maybe seen as a bigger separate issue, but it's so interrelated. So I think we need to make sure that that's at least kept in mind as this work group is working.
Got on there again.
Clarence.
For the reminder. So, a lot of my thoughts were already echoed by my colleagues, but, certainly very horrified by the circumstances of police brutality that have occurred over the last week or so that have been reported. And certainly, it's a really reflection of probably many, many more occurrences that don't have that same level of publicity and aren't as well reported, but certainly important and impactful too, that we need to continue to address. So I think, I'm certainly concerned about, the level of disparities when it comes to how law enforcement can potentially take action against, members of the public. And I think it is something that, looking forward to working with our House colleagues and the new provisions that may come forward from this new work group when we get back into session to address some really systemic issues that we need to face and take a long, hard look at as a community and as a state to figure out how we can address this moving forward. So, all very important issues that we need to look at as well. I think the other thing that I'll move on to some other questions, and this one is somewhat pandemic related, COVID-19 related. We know that there are a lot of folks that were trying to apply for unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, and experiencing a lot of challenges in being able to do so. We've had some questions come in, this one, for example, asking why Maryland's unemployment system and website was broken. It was so broken even before the COVID-19 pandemic. What can Marylanders expect in the future with what it looks like before many of us are able to get back to work? We had another question about how we can register for unemployment with the current system that's in place, recognizing that it is a broken system. And so, I think all of us are very, very disappointed with how the unemployment application system rolled out from the Department of Labor. And it's something that we've stayed on top of the department and this administration on to try to get answers for our constituents. We've heard from many, many, many constituents who expressed frustration and concern and some horrific stories about being on hold for hours and hours and hours, who need help and are not able to get the help that they need because of a very broken system, which I think is very unacceptable given the circumstances. And so let me turn it over to some of my colleagues to address some of these questions as well.
I'm not sure there's much to add to that. I mean, none of us are going to sit here and defend the system. I will say that when we listened to the department explain what the issues were, there's no question that the number of unemployment, coming into the pandemic just was sort of unprecedentedly large. They weren't prepared for it. And when they began to, I think they also, though, completely underestimated what they were seeing. So they initially tried to bring people over from other departments to handle cases. Then they hired some 250. And then I think in the last week, they've hired another 500. So I think their response was more measured from a budgetary standpoint than the significance of the events going on required. And that has explained, in my opinion, a lot of it, that they just thought that they could handle it manpower-wise and didn't want to make the decision to spend the additional money to hire people to do the work at the levels that it's been clear. No question, it was hard to predict the number of claims that would come in. And when you see 2 to 3 times as many claims in a few weeks that you normally see in a year, that's going to be a struggle for anyone. So I want to make it clear that I think we our state employees have, worked very, very hard. And I think the administration has worked hard. But like everything else, when we look back, we can see where there were errors made that they could have done better. But they certainly are working with our offices to, at least try and touch base with the constituents who we've been hearing from. That is cold comfort if you've been relying on unemployment funds and you're 6 weeks in and not a check has come through yet. So that's all I want to say about it.
Go ahead, Eric. Oh, thanks. Okay. So, echoing certainly what my colleagues have said, but I think it is, there's the fact that the system was just overwhelmed. They underestimated and weren't prepared for the volume of claims that would be coming in. There's also a piece of it that is, this is a system designed to make it hard to get benefits. Okay. This is a system that is designed to go out of their way to make sure no one ever gets a dime they're not entitled to. Okay. And so we're so concerned about anyone potentially getting money they weren't entitled to that we make it difficult. We make it overly burdensome for people who are in a time of need and struggling to take care of their families. And it just compounded with the volume. So I think, yes, there's a lot that the department could have and should have done differently. And I think this is highlighting some of the design of the system, right? This is a system that is not necessarily designed to make it easier for people to get help. And I think we need to work together with our federal delegation to look at, okay, are there some changes that should be made? Because the unemployment insurance system, even though it's administered by the state, the program is a federal program, right? So the department does have limitations in what accommodations they can make to try to streamline it and facilitate the process. We do need to work together with our federal delegation and take a look at that.
So this is a chance for me to do something before it gets to be 8:30 and tell you that the four of us have four really great people working behind us, okay? We have staffs that do not have to cooperate. We have separate offices. We're separately elected, technically speaking. We work as a team. They've taken that from us and they work as a team. And they have worked tirelessly together as a unit to create the spreadsheet that the Department of Labor requests that they send for constituents. And when people mail us who aren't constituents, they have been fastidious about making sure that their representatives knew that they needed help. But they have been sending it in. Now, we've been getting the responses we want, but these are the same people that are the reason the four of us are so nicely on camera tonight as well. Katie Meadow set up the thing in a large sense, but and she works for Jessica. John Michael Gudger works for Terry Hill. Scott Tiffin is crack staffer for, I don't know if that's a good word used. He's a great staffer for Clarence Lamb. And Sean Ford just about loses sleep working for me. And the four of them are doing a great job, but it's relevant to this question because this is something that has been stressing them out because they're not sure what to do. They've followed as many instructions and they are compiling lists and sending them and badgering the Department of Labor and trying to get people answers as quick as they can. And they're doing a great job on our behalf. They're making us good constituent service delegates by being good constituent service staffers. And so before we get off the air, I want to thank them, well, not only for setting this up tonight, but for the hard work that they do as well.
Muted again, so I started speaking, but anything else to add from anyone else? Okay. So we had a question that came in recently. This was a question regarding, I guess, retirement benefits and tax income. There's a question here with regards to any tax relief for retirees or first responders that were passed during session, why or why not. I believe there was a bill that was passed, HB 505, which allowed Baltimore County residents to receive a property tax credit if they were over the age of 60. So it was a bill that did make it through the legislature and I believe was passed. I think it has gone into law. So it's something that we are certainly hearing from a lot of constituents about. And I think I'm open to looking at passing a similar piece of legislation for Howard County as well. But wanted to address that question that was recently just submitted. Anything else that my colleagues would like to add on that? Okay. If not, we have some questions here with regards to educational and healthcare disparities. We can start with education first. The question that came in was what specific strategies to support educators in ensuring that there is equity in our distance learning that are being implemented in our school systems. There are barriers to engagement for many of our children of color who are facing these days. They will continue to suffer if we do not make sure that special programs remain and that we keep funding in the budget for staff of these programs. So these are programs to support educators, particularly in distance learning, and for those who are helping to educate children of color.
So like everything else we've talked about with COVID tonight, we're realizing that the challenges are new and difficult. And certainly, and Jessica will tell you this because she watches what happens in education in Ways and Means, and you've all seen the bills that come out. We passed lots of bills to try to create greater education equity. In fact, that was a large part of the blueprint. Something called community schools was a big piece of that, which was supposed to actually help concentration of poverty areas with their schooling. So what this has done is laid bare some of those inequities. I saw a figure that said as many as 40% of homes in Baltimore don't have broadband. And so when we say, well, they can just get online with their teachers, they can't. And at the same time, we're having the same problems with students actually getting online. In other words, they're children, many of them, some of them at various levels of maturity. And if they don't have the support at home to ask them or incentivize them to get online and do some of the work, they won't. And anecdotally, I've asked teacher friends, are all your students coming on board? The answer is no. Okay. Of the students that are coming on board, are they all doing the work? No. And so there is a document out. MSD has produced it. It's called Recovery. It's a recovery document, but it is, in my opinion, vague, and it needs to become more specific. And I am we're in conversations about what we think the State Department of Education needs to do to actually pivot well in the situation, since nobody's entirely sure what schooling will look like in the fall. We have to watch students falling that fall behind, students with different levels, different attention spans, different motivations. And as I say, the inequities are even more apparent to us now, both in terms of the kind of support students get and the actual equipment that they have available to get work done. And I'm afraid we are increasing that, the achievement gap right now as we speak. And I wish I could say I know the answer, but part of the answer is just to get the State Department of Education on this with their expertise, and we will work on them on that.
Anyone else?
No, I was just going to say, Eric's, it's not much to add when Eric speaks on education, because he's an expert on it, and I'm fortunate to have a colleague who I can work so closely with on it. But I guess the point I want to make, and I think that's the reason the question was asked, is we're all in this together may be true, and we may be in the same sea, but some of us are in dinghies and some of us are in yachts. And when the storm comes, it is a lot easier to ride it out when you're in a really big boat with good balance and propellers than it is when you're in a boat and you don't even have an oar. So the things that all four of us have been fighting for from even before we became legislators are about these inequities that are there. And if nothing else comes out of this period of time, I am hopeful that people will stop pretending that they don't exist or that policies do not have consequences. When Jessica says that one of the reasons people are having a hard time getting unemployment, it's because the system was designed to make it hard. The reality is, for decades and longer, we have put policies in place at the federal, state, and local level that are designed to keep marginalized people marginalized, to keep poor people poor. And so when we are dealing with what we're dealing with, whether it's in education, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in criminal justice, we may be disgusted by seeing what these inequities look like, but really none of us should be surprised.
Okay. Along that vein, there were some questions relating to health disparities as well. There's a question here relating to the rate of poor health outcomes, including death, in many areas of the state is almost double for Black residents. The medical literature is beginning to show evidence that medical systems create more barriers for people of color. Much of this relates to bias created by restrictive systems that are put in place. And for example, this also pertains to coronavirus and lower access to coronavirus testing and contact tracing, and therefore higher rates of transmission amongst individuals in the Black community. And there's also another question here: how are we in Howard County and Baltimore County effectively addressing the needs of Black and brown people with underlying health conditions? Anyone want to take a stab at that first?
Well, Clarence, since you are the public health expert, why don't you start? I think we all have something to add, but I think you're the one who's living daily at the front lines of how do we deal with this. You have the familiarity with the numbers from a public health standpoint. I think we'd all, the folks asking the question want to hear from you first.
Sure. So, I think from a public health standpoint, we know that there are a lot of things that factor into people's health, and it may not be as readily apparent as some of the services and care that you receive at a hospital or at a clinic. For example, we know that education factors into health outcomes, that people that have higher levels of education have better health outcomes. We know that transportation is important to ensuring adequate health services, that people that have greater difficulty in being able to get to their clinic appointments, have worse health outcomes as well. We know that the environment plays a tremendous factor in how people's health plays out, that certainly there are elements of the environment, whether it's pollution or where people live, that affects their health outcomes because they may be exposed to more chemicals. There may be disparities in how pollution affects certain communities, that there may be areas of the state where they're more impoverished and there are actually higher rates of pollution in those areas. So there's certainly some sense of economic or environmental justice as well, concerns. All of those kind of play into health. And so while people think naturally about, the disparities there, their disparities are there because there's real systemic problems on the top level of health, but also with all these other factors as well. And whether that's, law enforcement or education or the environment or, access to technology or, transportation issues, they all contribute to the social determinants of health that determine how well people are able to live, the chronic diseases that they have or that afflict their families, and even their life expectancy. That even within the city of Baltimore, for example, we know that when you look at the life expectancy between Roland Park and certain areas of West Baltimore, areas that are only spread out by a distance of maybe just a few miles, that there are, decades of difference, maybe almost 20 years of difference in life expectancy. And that's because of economic challenges, educational challenges, transportation challenges, opportunity challenges, all of those same challenges that we've been talking about as a broader community as well, that these individuals face. And so, while the health disparities are ones that we want to focus on as well, I think they're indicative of a larger problem of just disparities in general that we as legislators need to continue to try to address, moving forward. And I think all of us are committed to doing so.
I agree 100%, but I think there's also a couple other things that people need to keep in mind. One is that we have a tendency to put socioeconomic status and race and mix them in the same bag. And with the COVID and the predisposition, who seems to be getting sicker, we have socioeconomic factors where poor communities, whether they're Black, white, brown, or whatever, are seeing different kind of impacts than wealthier communities. But since we have disproportionate representations of poor people who are Black and brown, we see that exacerbated. On the other hand, when we look at, or in addition to that, when we look at, say, in Baltimore City, with the zip code with the highest incidence, one of the reasons that zip code has high incidence is because they have a nursing home in that location. And the vast majority of the cases that rolled out for deaths came out of that nursing home. So it's our ability to break the numbers apart that help us to understand and come up with the strategies to address it. But there's another reason, in addition to sort of historic marginalization and how that affects stresses and environmental impacts and general health impacts and the higher rate of underlying diseases. And that is that we all are raised with varying understandings of what our rights and privileges are. So if we are all told that you show up in the ER, they tell you we can't test you. We're not even going to talk about the emergency room that you may go to and the quality of the hospital that you may go to. But let's say equal quality hospital, we all show up and they say, we can't really treat you, go home. And if you get really sick, then you can come back. What does really sick mean? If you're from a community where most of your life you've been told to be quiet, your problems aren't important, by the time you think you're sick enough to ask for someone to help you again, it may be too late because you're not used to getting a positive response when you're pressed. You're being told, we already told you, why are you showing up again? If on the other hand, you've been raised in an environment where you're told that the system is designed to work for you, then you don't tend to hesitate if you think you're a little bit sick. You feel like you have a right to demand service. And so you are more likely to go back at an earlier stage of the disease. And I don't know what the numbers will show in the end, but I know that's one of the things we're looking at. So when we look at when do people call an ambulance? When do people return to an emergency room after being told, go home and take care of it on your own? That we will see that there are also disparities being told once, we can't do anything for you, between different groups of people. And I think that will break out like so many things do because of our systemic issues along racial lines, that certain people will hesitate to return to an emergency room once they've been told this is not where you need to be treated. So I think there are just layers and layers and layers. So the other part of the question was, what are the different jurisdictions doing to address it? And both executives of Howard County and Baltimore County, so Calvin Ball and Johnny Olszewski, have been working very hard with their health officers to identify where the areas of greatest need are in trying to direct that there are testing facilities there. Their approaches are a little bit different. They're each having to address the issue of, if we have areas that rely on public transportation, do we have testing facilities that are close enough? So in Baltimore County, the idea of rolling out and working with the Rite Aid, so now people can get tested at a Rite Aid, that's a lot easier for people than having to get up to Towson or to some other station that requires you to be able to drive up. Howard County's doing it different ways, and there are other jurisdictions that are even making, and this was one of the suggestions that was made while we were still in Annapolis, that we ought to be looking at having caseworkers who can go to people's homes if they need to be tested, so that everybody isn't required to come out to go to a testing facility. And as we now roll out broader testing and contact tracing, I think we're going to be looking at and seeing what the executives have rolled out, a hodgepodge of different ways to try to make sure that that happens. And our federal partners are trying to work also to make sure that the areas with the most need are targeted to get the funding, and that funding is based on where those hotspot populations are, and not simply, population and numbers and densities.
Sorry if I'm a little distracted. There's some explosions happening. I hope they're just fireworks outside here. I'm in Baltimore City. I think we have about 5 minutes left, and there are some questions relating to COVID and testing, and also a vaccine. There's a question here: when a vaccine for COVID-19 becomes available, do you favor it being mandatory? If not, what incentives can be provided to ensure sufficient immunity? And then there's also a related question. In our district, how well is COVID testing accessibility progressing? Where are the available testing sites, and what else can be done to improve access?
So I'll try to go real quick because we're almost out of time. Certainly in schools, especially with communicable diseases, once there's a vaccine, schools will often require students to be vaccinated before they can come to the school, on the off chance that they would spread the disease. if we let a lot of students come unvaccinated, they would spread it amongst themselves. And this can be added to the list of things that students need to be vaccinated for before they come to school.
Anyone else?
Okay, I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute. I will tell you that I am a little, I don't have an answer to that question because I am a little bit concerned about the Trump administration's warp speed vaccine plan for a couple of reasons. What it sounds like they are envisioning is that multiple pharmaceutical companies will be allowed to offer their vaccines for what are essentially what we would call stage 2 testing, that they will be asked to offer their vaccines to different populations of several thousand people. And then we see how the people react to the vaccine to decide which are the good vaccines. And I'm very concerned about that. I think it may serve their purpose of getting something out quickly, but the feds have already lowered the usual testing standards for COVID-related medical tests and COVID and drugs and treatments. They've also, given financial incentives to these companies to come up with things. We also, at the vaccine court, which is a court that basically mitigates because vaccine companies are immune from prosecution if there is any damage. So the vaccine court, apparently right now, there's also a move to exclude any COVID vaccine from any compensation should there be damage to people who receive it. And then finally, the FDA has done some additional waivers of the usual testing of things. And so I am not in favor of the American population being treated like a petri dish to compare early prospects for a vaccine. So whether or not I would support incentives or mandatory would depend on whether I believe that we as a government have done the due diligence to give the same kind of assurance that most Americans expect that anything that we offer them is indeed safe and effective. And if we're not going to be able to feel that those assurances can be given, then my view is going to be very different than if we are.
So the only thing that I'll add to that is that the governor already has the authority to require vaccines or mass vaccinations in the event of a catastrophic health emergency. And also the state Department of Education also has the ability, in working in conjunction with the Maryland Department of Health, to be able to require vaccines for certain conditions for children that are entering schools. I know we have just 2 minutes left here. I guess last question then, also in a way pandemic related, but bringing some of these issues together. How can we continue to support teacher pay during a pandemic? Related to that, where does education fit into the legislative priorities given COVID? And that's our last question.
It's hardly a short question. I think in short, I would say that, like, as far as the state goes and state funding, Blueprint and the funding streams that are in place, we're already prepared to do those, and we're prepared to make adjustments if we need to. We may need to, but this is no time to be making those decisions. As I said, I think the governor made a few that he shouldn't have when he was able to, that were premature in terms of what we're seeing coming. This is why the legislature meets every year, so that we can make adjustments, and we may have to. The other question was about COVID-19, but I think I answered that before too, because in a COVID-19 world, we are going to have to deal with maintaining, not maintaining, but closing the achievement gap and not letting it grow.
So I know we're short on time, and I'll echo what Eric said. And I appreciate that was supposed to be our last question, but I need to just mention one I see, because I'm so happy to see this being asked, what local charities could use our help. And the answer is all of them. This is a really tough time for nonprofits as our economy is suffering, philanthropic giving suffers. So if you are enduring this pandemic with the financial means to make some contributions, please reach out to your favorite charities. They all need help. We know there's a lot of need for food and basic rent assistance and all those things, but other nonprofits, arts organizations, they're all struggling. Especially those serving immigrants who are not eligible for a lot of the other kinds of aid that are around in the pandemic. So I wanted to toss that in also.
And if you're feeling safe and you want to go out and do some physical work, like load groceries or do something like that, I serve on the local board of the YMCA, and there are volunteer opportunities to go and pack up trucks and unload trucks and take stuff to rec centers where the food's being picked up. So there are hands-on things you can do that actually make a difference. A lot of people don't want to come out, and if you don't, that makes sense. But they need people who are willing to come out, who feel like they're safe coming out and will, just to help them. I did once, and probably I'm too old to have done that, but I did in any case. They take great safety precautions with you, and I felt pretty safe. So that's all I would add.
And my last 2 cents would be that as the reopening begins and people are making individual decisions about what they feel is safe for them to do and not, and what businesses and all of that stuff they want to visit, I would just ask that people stay mindful of what the guidelines are, not only in your local jurisdiction, but where you may be going to, and actually follow the health experts and their recommendations. In other words, I want folks to treat this as if their life depended on it, because it actually does.
So that's well said. I don't think I have anything else to add to that. Want to thank our legislators, my colleagues, for joining us together in this very unique town hall. If it's something that we receive a lot of feedback for, we may have again in the future. Again, I want to thank our staff for pulling all of this together, to Sean, to John Michael, to Katie, to Scott, and then also to our interpreters as well. And to all of you for attending this town hall. Certainly very unique circumstances, but thank you for listening, for tuning in, for submitting questions, for participating, because it's important for our democracy. And so we hope that you will continue to be well, stay safe, and stay strong, and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.